Now, as we mentioned earlier, when we are conducting research using the scientific method, we have to pick a particular research methodology that we're going to use for our study. And media effects research that's based in the social sciences uses a variety of different methods, and this slide talks about three common ones: experiments, survey research, and content analysis. In experiments, a researcher will examine a particular hypothesis in a controlled setting, in a controlled environment where, to some extent, the researcher is able to prevent outside factors from skewing the results. In this experiment, what the researcher will do will be to investigate this relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And the way that the researcher does this in an experiment is to have two different groups of participants in their experiment. One group is called the experimental group, and the other one is called the control group. The difference between these two groups is that for the experimental group, the researcher will expose that experimental group to the independent variable, all right? So that in our study about violent video games and whether or not they affect someone's behavior, for this experimental group, we would expose them to the violent video games. We would have participants in the experimental group play lots of really violent video games. We might have them play Grand Theft Auto. Now, the control group is not exposed to the independent variable. So, in our hypothetical study, the control group would not play violent video games. Or they may be exposed to another type of media that is not violent at all. They might play Pac-Man or The Sims or some video game that has no violence represented in that game. Right, and then in our experiment, what we do is we see if then there is any difference between the experimental group that's been exposed to the independent variable and the control group that has not. All right, so that again, in our hypothetical study, what we would do after having the experimental group play the violent video games is then we would monitor the behavior of both people in the experimental group and the control group. And we would see if there's any difference in the behavior for the participants in the experimental group and those in the control group. All right. If we found that the participants in the experimental group seemed to exhibit behavior that was more aggressive than the control group. Let's say that in the laboratory settings, we found that people in the experimental group that had played these video games got into arguments more frequently than the control group, or they were more likely to hit a Bobo doll or something. Right? Then we would find support for our hypothesis that violent video games encourage aggressive behavior, because then we would have some evidence showing that participants in the experimental group that played the violent video games were more aggressive than those in the control group that had not played these violent video games, right? Now, a very different type of research method is survey research. And in this, we do not have any controlled laboratory environment as we might in an experiment. Instead, in a survey, we develop some survey. We put together a survey that has a list of questions that are related to the topic that we are investigating, this survey will also have lots of questions related to the independent and dependent variable. All right, so again, going back to our hypothetical study of the influence that violent video games might have on aggressive behavior. In our survey, we would ask lots of questions about people's use of media, about people's use of video games. We'd ask lots of questions about what kinds of games they played, whether or not they are extremely violent. We'd ask them about questions about how often they play these violent video games and so forth. And then we'd also ask lots of questions about the person's background. How old is the person, race, ethnicity, gender, level of education, and so on. And then we'd also ask a lot of questions related to the dependent variable here, aggressive behavior. We'd ask questions about a person's level of aggression in everyday life. How often do people get into physical fights or conflicts? How often do people get involved in really vigorous arguments with other people? And we'd ask lots of questions to try and get at that aspect of a person's behavior. All right, and once we have our survey compiled, then we would distribute it to a certain number of subjects that we would want to reach for this project. And we might have people respond to the survey in a variety of ways. We might conduct phone interviews, all right, or we might have people fill out the survey through email, or we might have people that are enrolled in a college class fill out the survey. All right, so a variety of ways to get people to respond to the survey. And what we would do is we would try to get enough people for our survey responses that would give us a representative sample of society more generally, so that we could generalize the results of our survey to some larger, broader population. Now, in our survey, what we would try to do in our research is to see if there's any relationship between our independent and dependent variables, all right? So that we would investigate whether or not, our survey respondents that watched and played violent video games, did they seem to be more aggressive and violent than people in our survey that did not play those violent video games, all right? And we would see if there's any kind of relationship between those two factors. Another method that is used, and it's very different from experiments and surveys, is content analysis, all right? In this type of study, we don't have subjects at all. We don't have people participate as subjects in experiments or as survey respondents. In content analysis, all we're trying to do is to analyze some type of media content and some aspect of media content, all right? For instance, how violent is the content, or how sexually explicit is this content. So going back to our research question about violent video games, in content analysis, we would do a systematic analysis of the content of video games to assess just how violent they are. All right, so we might take a certain number of video games and then develop some method to count up the number of acts of violence in these video games, and some approach to identifying the different kinds of violent acts that are represented. Are the violent acts, for instance, sexually aggressive in nature? So again, in content analysis, in this type of research, it tends to be quantitative. All right, that all we're doing is we're counting the frequency of the representation of certain types of content.